The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 23. After Birth Complications in which Lydia wakes up in a probable life. Inside the baby, Lydia scowled, figuratively speaking. It seemed almost unbelievable that she couldn't talk. So this was what rebirth or any kind of birth was. It certainly wasn't very dignified, and it presented all sorts of difficulties that she'd, conveniently, forgotten when she decided to be born again. Again? Or was she being born in many times and places all at once, as OverSoul 7 maintained? Of course you are, dear Lydia, OverSoul 7 said. Lydia saw him mentally. Her eyes, or rather Tweety's, weren't focusing properly, but in any case, 7 and Cypress weren't visible to Bianca or Joseph. 7 is here to help you handle the situation intelligently, Cypress said, and I'm here to see how well he does. But really, Lydia, there's no need to be nervous, none at all. We really should call Lydia Tweety now, shouldn't we? 7 asked. Or is she still Lydia, learning to be Tweety? The baby set up such a howl that Bianca cried, "Joseph, listen to her. What shall we do? Her face is all red." "Arrgh!" Joseph thundered. "Do something! I'm afraid to touch her." "Don't yell, you'll frighten her," Bianca cried. "Joseph hasn't changed. I can see that," OverSoul 7 said. "But you took his character into consideration when you decided to be his daughter, of course." "I suppose it's too late to pull out now?" Lydia asked dryly. Cypress smiled. "You sound so much like 7 when you talk like that. But that's to be expected. He's your soul, after all." The baby quieted. Bianca and Joseph tiptoed into the next room. "Thank heaven," Lydia said. She slipped out of Tweety's body and joined 7 and Cypress by the cradle. Lydia appeared as a young woman of about 20. She strode vigorously about the room, puffing on a hallucinatory cigarette. "They don't have cigarettes like that in the 17th century, by the way," Cypress said. She appeared as another young woman for Lydia's benefit. 7 couldn't decide what form to take, so he tried several until Cypress asked him to settle down. "I can't help being nervous," he said. "I'm supposed to help Lydia, but how can I when she insists on pacing the room like that?" "You'd pace the room too if you were being born again, and into the 17th century after you died in the 20th, Lydia retorted. "But I am," 7 answered. "That's one of the main issues of all this. Only you're the part of me that's closer to the experience." 7 looked hopefully to Cypress, who said, "You're doing fine. Explain it to her yourself." "That sounds like I'm not myself, just a part of you," Lydia said, puffing on the cigarette. Tweety started to cry again. "Oh, hell," Lydia muttered. "That's no attitude," 7 started to say, but all of a sudden he couldn't get his footing, and with good reason. He was trying to stand up in 3 different rooms at once. So, seeing his predicament, he dematerialized and regained his balance. Then he realized what was wrong. He was seeing too many times at once. because in one room Lydia was dying in the 20th century. He recognized at once the surroundings in the old people's rest home where she died. But it took a minute for him to put the picture into the correct sequence. In the second room, transposed over the first one, Lydia was being born as Tweety in the 17th century, and that was where she belonged in her now. And in the third room, she was dying again in the life that she was just beginning. 7. Stop drifting, Cypress called from the second room, and sheepishly 7 returned and stood by Tweety's bedside. He grinned. The baby's head was as fresh as a peach, only 2 soft, open eyes staring up at him, quite like a peach suddenly given sight, he thought, and looking out from itself. "Will I lose all of my own memories?" Lydia asked anxiously. "I will, won't I?" "No, now, don't start worrying about that again," Cypress answered. "If 7 can remember who he is, you certainly can. Attaining to your soulhood is much more taxing in its way, but you don't have to worry about that yet." 7 frowned. "I wish you'd stop just staring at the baby, Lydia," he said. "You have to identify with her sooner or later. Procrastinating doesn't help matters." "You aren't thinking of putting it off at this late date, are you?" Lydia's eyes flew open. "I never thought of that. I didn't realize that I still could change my mind," she exclaimed. Cypress said sternly, "7, you aren't helping matters one bit. You're just making the whole thing more difficult." 7 grimaced, took the form of an earnest young man, and paced the room. "Well, maybe," he said, "but Lydia's one of my personalities after all. She has the right to know that she can change her mind, though it's true that such things are frowned upon. You'd have to get a replacement now, Lydia, and someone who's interested in 17th century life. People are very touchy about which centuries they get born into, and the 17th century isn't a favorite, in case you're interested." "Some wouldn't touch it with a—" "7, that's enough," Cypress interrupted. "Lydia, try to relax. Just because you're fond of the 17th century, 7 doesn't have to be, of course. But he isn't being very diplomatic either." The baby stirred. "It's a living organism," Cypress said gently. "Prepared for you, waiting for your consciousness to make it human. Now it has body consciousness, but no self in your terms. Are you going to give it selfhood or not? Some individuals enter the baby before birth, as you know, and some after. But you are dwaddling some." 7 grinned. Lydia said, almost laughing, "How could I not, after that? Of course I will. I just got stage fright, that's all. I know I'm not saying goodbye to myself, but becoming another self but not losing what I am. I'll do my best for Tweety. As Tweety I'll—" But the oddest thing was happening, and Lydia opened her eyes to a scene of such suddenly recalled delight that she cried out. There was her bedroom, surely hers, with sun-splashed wallpaper and white ruffled curtains. She was looking down at the bed covers from the viewpoint of something sitting up in bed. She was staring at, yes, the baby in her arms. She'd just given birth a short while ago, But to whom? Let me hold this scene, this moment, she thought desperately. The baby was, oh God, real, stillbirth smelly, whatever that meant. And hers, 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 she chanted, dizzy with elation. The warm living curve of her sunshiny arms filled with that new, solid, wiggling flesh. And how curious! The baby's eyes were so clear, like a tiny animal's, knowing yet unknowing. She'd write a poem about it later, but not now. Only, where was Roger? And what was the baby's name? Why couldn't she remember? Suddenly she was scared, and the baby looked almost unfamiliar and strange. "Roger?" she called. "Rog?" He came hurrying in, a towel over his arm. "What's wrong?" And seeing him, so substantial and there and solid, for someone so bony and gawky, she started laughing and crying at once. "Oh God, I don't know. I took a nap, as you suggested, and when I woke up, I couldn't remember Rog Jr.'s name. There, see? I know it now. But my own baby's name. And the room seemed so funny, and I had the feeling of doing all this before." "Crazy puss," Roger said, bending down to kiss her, but she looked up at him and thought, now, who was that? His face was kind, anxious, loving, with funny off-center eyes. But who was it? "Who is that?" OverSoul 7 asked Cypress. "You should know," Cypress answered. "It's Roger, Lydia's husband." Cypress and 7 stood invisibly by the bed, and Lydia didn't see them any more than Roger did. Then Lydia began crying. "Come on," Roger said. "You told me yourself that new mothers can expect all sorts of goofy feelings at first. Forget it. You'll scare the baby. Anyhow, I was going to bring you in a dish of fresh peaches. See what a handy husband I am." "Peaches?" Lydia exclaimed. "That's it! I was dreaming about babies and peaches, or something. But God, I must look a wreck. Is my nose all red from crying? Maybe it's the stupid drugs the doctors give you during delivery. No, they wouldn't affect me now, would they?" She paused. "I'm still confused, though. What the devil is the date?" Roger went, "Tut, tut, tut," made a mock bow, and said, "Madame, it's October 18, 1927. Is there anything else you want to know? I'm your personal information service." Lydia's eyes widened. "Now I remember," she cried. "I was dreaming about the 17th century for some reason, and when I woke up, I didn't know where the devil I was." She shivered and added, "Look! The baby's sleeping. God knows what he's dreaming about. Put him in the crib, would you? Well, at least I'm flat now and not big as an elephant. I'm going to get up and dress and—" "Don't drink too much tonight, though, hon. It isn't good for new mothers," Roger said, regretting his words at once. "Oh, you had to say that, didn't you?" she shouted. "You had to spoil this beautiful afternoon." "What do you mean, beautiful afternoon? A few minutes ago you were crying, and I cheered you up," Roger shouted back. "What's going on?" 7 asked anxiously. "Lydia's in the wrong life. I thought maybe she was just reliving a memory, but she's really into this. She just finished that life. That baby is her son Roger." "So I see," Cypress answered dryly. "Seven, all lives are parallel. You know that. Otherwise Lydia couldn't have gone from the 20th century to the 17th. Yes, I know. In theory that works. But in practice, well, Lydia's supposed to be a baby, Tweety, right now. She's not supposed to be having a baby in the 20th century. How do I get her back on the right track?" Seven paused for only a moment and went on. "Look at her," he said. "Now, I remember this particular day. If we don't stop her, she'll live that life all over again, won't she?" And that was the day she fell in love with Lawrence, husband or no, and Seven was so upset he dematerialized even to Cypress, turning into a worried swirl of air that rushed around inside itself. "I've got to stop her," he said, wordlessly of course. "I'm her soul after all. And what about Tweety? Cypress, I'm really upset. Now help me." Cypress sighed and said, "Stop that swirling. You'll make yourself dizzy." Seven stopped and turned into a small white, worried human face that was invisible to everyone but Cypress. "Don't you understand what might happen?" he asked. "Lydia has free will, you know." "Well, of course she has." "That makes it worse, don't you see? I can't understand why you aren't concerned. If she falls in love with Lawrence today, she'll have to go through the whole thing again. But with free will, suppose she doesn't fall in love with him." "I don't follow you," Cypress said, trying not to smile. "That's exactly what worries me," Seven cried. "You're supposed to be my teacher. But in Earth-type orientation, I'm beginning to wonder. If Lydia doesn't fall in love with Lawrence, or if she uses her free will to change anything at all in this life, she'll alter everything else. And maybe she won't even be born as Tweety." "Seven, look," Cypress directed. The whole house opened to Seven's vision. And on the doorstep stood a young man in an opera cape. He carried a bouquet of flowers, and looked so jaunty and pleased with himself, and so conscious of the fine figure he cut, that Cypress started laughing. But OverSoul 7 was nearly in a frenzy. "It's Lawrence," he cried, "and he's alone, just like he was the last time this happened. He mustn't go in until I get Lydia out of this and back where she belongs." "Seven, come back," Cypress called, but it was too late. Seven changed into a small, angry October wind that rushed around the edges of the porch eaves outside, rustled the flowers in Lawrence's hands, and blew his cape out suddenly so that Lawrence shouted, "Whew! What a wind! Don't go inside." Seven sent the thought directly into Lawrence's mind. "You mustn't go in there." And the wind wrenched the bouquet from Lawrence's hands and sent the flowers flying across the porch, down the steps, and past the geraniums that Lydia had planted by the walk. "Damnation!" Lawrence shouted, chasing the bouquet. Seven returned to Lydia's room to find Cypress smiling, a smile in which sincerity and amusement were equally mixed. She said, "Do sit down and enjoy Lydia. I'll explain it all to you later. You cause yourself so much trouble, needlessly." Lydia was magnificent. Seven had to agree. She was applying makeup from small jars, holding her head so proudly, tilting it to get just the right effect, The dress she wore was very short, with a flounce. Her stockings were sheer and black. Her cropped black hair lay almost flat against her head. She was putting on a pair of triangular silver earrings, and suddenly Seven realized when he'd seen them before. "Those were the earrings that caught Lawrence's fancy," he shouted. "Lydia, do you know what you're doing? Take those earrings off at once. Come back where you belong. In a few moments you'll see Lawrence in that dumb cape for the first time and fall in love with him. Then I'll never get you out of here. And if you don't fall in love with him, I don't know what kind of trouble you'll get us into, because then you'll change everything." Roger came into the bedroom. "Ready, hon?" he asked. "I just saw Lawrence coming up the walk. His girl isn't with him, though." He stopped and said reapprovingly, "You're smoking, and you know that's not supposed to be good for you." "Young mothers, yeah, I know," Lydia said, glowering at him. "You just don't think smoking is feminine, that's all. Well, I'll smoke if I want to." Seven shouted, "Lydia, come with me at once." Cypress said gently, "Seven, it's no use." Lydia didn't believe she had a soul in that life, and she didn't believe in hearing voices inside her head either. "She won't hear a thing you say." "You don't understand," Seven exclaimed. "You're too remote. Lydia's my personality and—" He broke off, groaning, as a grinning, disheveled Lawrence, disarmingly devilish in his infernal cape, stood triumphantly just inside the open front door, his cheeks red from the autumn air. And Lydia stood in the hallway, staring at him. Hooked, Seven thought. He turned to Cypress with dismay. Lawrence said, "I had the funniest feeling that you didn't want me to come inside, like something was trying to keep me out." "Don't be silly. Nothing could be further from the truth." Lydia smiled and came out into the living room while Roger closed the front door. Without knowing why, Roger suddenly felt sad, and watching him, Seven wondered how much Roger knew or remembered. Lydia was obviously ignorant of what was really happening, and Lawrence was positively gleeful. Roger looked at him and said uncomfortably, "What happened to your girl?" "She couldn't make it," Lawrence said cheerfully. "You'll have to share Lydia with me for the evening." "Why, that's pretty flippant," Lydia said, laughing. She threw herself down on the couch. "Something else is wrong," Seven said to Cypress. "I just remembered. Lawrence is supposed to be a good deal younger than Lydia." They fell in love under these circumstances, only she was so much older that the whole idea seemed ridiculous at first. She was at least 10 years older, and now, Cypress asked. She and Seven were 2 points of light hovering near the ceiling. Seven looked down and said, "Wait, I'm getting it, I think. Creativity happens constantly, and all existences are open-ended. So somehow Lydia and Lawrence are doing it differently this time. They're more or less the same age. But what about Tweety?" "Let's see for ourselves," Cypress said. "Watch." Cypress and Seven looked down again. The baby, Roger Jr., was crying. Lydia got up and went in to quiet him. "What a crybaby!" she exclaimed. Then bending closer, she was struck by the living miracles of his eyes, so clear and brilliant and incredibly dear. Someone was saying, You see, your memories are alive and even changeable. You can live them in all of their dimensions, so there's no need to worry that you'll ever forget your experiences. For a moment, Lydia didn't know where she was or who was speaking. Then she saw the baby in the cradle and realized that she was standing there too, with Cypress and Seven. "This baby is Tweety," Seven said, grinning, "and we're back in the 17th century. Lydia stared at the room. It looked as real and solid as the other one had. "Sit down," Cypress laughed, "and I'll explain what happened." "Yes, I wish you would," Seven said, a bit tardily. Lydia nodded. She looked so confused that OverSoul 7 hallucinated a cigarette and lit it for her. Cypress said, "Lydia, when you're involved with any birth, then through association you remember other birth experiences sometimes. When you were born, or when you gave birth. Often death experiences are connected in the same way. Except your memories live, and this time you creatively changed them so that you and Lawrence were the same age. Your father, your new father, Joseph, can't bear to copy a painting, for example. So when you relived your memories, you changed the circumstances instead of copying them. When you're outside of strict three-dimensional reference, you have considerable freedom with your own experience. And your experiences form the basis of Tweety's unconsciousness," Seven said triumphantly. "I'm glad you understand," Cypress said. Seven blushed and said to Lydia, "I forgot too. And when I got confused earlier with the 3 rooms, then that, plus your confusion, triggered your 20th century memories and the whole episode." "But how many lives can you live at once?" asked Lydia, sounding exasperated. "You're usually aware of only one at a time," Cypress answered, smiling. "But before you're really all the way into a life, you're often conscious of—" Seven interrupted, looking at Cypress suspiciously, and said, "I have a feeling that there's more to this than you're letting on. But never mind. Lydia and I can handle whatever comes up. And come on, Lydia. You have to identify with Tweety now. You just can't go flicking in and out all the time." Lydia said, "And to think that I used to think that when you're dead, you were just dead, and that was the end of it. But this is too much, and I'm wondering, how real was the Lawrence I just met? And what about Roger? And when Lawrence and I meet as cousins, will we remember anything at all? And—" "See, I told you," OverSoul 7 said. "In your present state of development, you need one life to put yourself into. Otherwise, you will get all confused." "As you did, 7, Cypress said. "And still do. But Lydia, by entering fully into Tweety, you journey into the source of creativity. And from this, with your cooperation, the self-consciousness of Tweety will emerge." Lydia smiled and tried to answer, but suddenly she felt so drawn to the baby that everything else slipped away from her attention. End chapter 23. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.